Hello and welcome. In this video, I will briefly explain what a research model is and what are the different types of variables within a research model. So first, a research model is a representation of theorized relationships between different variables. So essentially, it is a representation of what you have theorized about the relationships between different variables. Depending on the depending on what relationships you theorize they have, variables can have different names within a research model. Let's see the examples. So first, the simplest case. You theorize that the training leads to productivity. If you provide training to employees, their productivity will increase. In this case, you are theorizing that providing training will lead to increased productivity. So, training in this case is affecting productivity. Productivity is not affecting training. So productivity is being influenced by training and training is influencing productivity. So we can say that training is our independent variable. This is the variable which is independent in the sense that it is not being influenced by the other variable, whereas productivity is the dependent variable which is being influenced by the independent variable. So this is the simplest of the relationships. Uh, okay. But then you say, okay, this is not the whole story. Actually, this is not what happens. The relationship between training and productivity is not direct. Actually, this is what happens. When you provide training to employees, their skill level improves, which in turn leads to productivity. So now you have introduced a new variable between the dependent, independent, and the dependent variable. So you assume, you theorize that the influence from training to productivity is transferred by an interceding variable, which is skill. So the skill is doing what? It is transferring the influence from training to productivity. So we call this variable a mediating variable or a mediator. So in this case, training is independent variable, productivity is dependent variable, and skill is our mediating variable, which is between the independent and the dependent variables. It transfers the influence from independent variable to dependent variable. But then you say, okay, this is also not the full story because the relationship between skill and productivity is not straightforward. It is not necessary that if the skill improves, productivity will also increase. This will depend how much the productivity will actually increase as a result of increase in improvement in the skill will depend on something else, which in this case we theorize is motivation. So we say that the relationship between skill and productivity is not straightforward. It is influenced by another variable which does not happen, which is not in between these two variables, but is from outside, is outside their relationship, and but it is influencing their relationship. So what motivation does in this case is that it moderates the influence of skill on the productivity, which means that how much skill will improvement in skill will lead to productivity in gain depends on the motivation of the workers. If motivation is high, improved skill level will lead to greater productivity. If motivation is low, improvement in the skill will not lead to as much increase in the productivity as it would have had there been greater motivation. So, motivation is actually controlling the strength of the relationship between skills and productivity. If motivation is high, the relationship between skill and productivity will be stronger. If motivation is low, the relationship between skill and productivity will be weaker. So we call this variable a moderating variable. So a moderating variable or a moderator. So now we have seen four different types of variables: independent variables, dependent variable, in mediating variable, which is between two variables, and fourth type of variable, which is a moderator, which controls or moderates the strength of the relationship between two variables. Okay. But we can uh, have a different classification of these variables. If you see, you will notice that these two variables, productivity and skill, are being influenced by other variables within our model. Our model currently has these four variables, but skill and productivity are being influenced by other variables. Skill is being influenced by training, productivity is being influenced by skill, and then productivity is being indirectly influenced by motivation. But training and motivation are not being influenced by any other variable of, within our framework or within our model. Motivation is not being affected by productivity or skill or training. Similarly, training is not being influenced by skill, motivation, or productivity. There might be variables that, which influence these variables, but they are not in our model. So the variables which are influenced by other variables within our model are called endogenous variables, and the variables which are not influenced by other variables within a model are called exogenous variables. Finally, what we saw earlier, this thing, representation of how different variables are related to each other, which variable is influencing which, and which is being influenced by which. This sort of representation of relationships is called a model. This model is, some people like to call it a theoretical model, some other people call it a research model, there are others who like to call it a conceptual model. So these are the terms which are used interchangeably. However, some people will insist that conceptual model is not same as theoretical model and research model. You can use those two terms, theoretical model and research model, interchangeably, but conceptual model is a bit different, they will argue. They say that conceptual model is bit more abstract. It is not as detailed. For example, for example, we can uh, we can call this a theoretical conceptual model, which conceptualizes relationship between variables at a higher level of abstraction. This model conceptualizes that a stimulus affects organism, and then organism processes that stimulus, and then it gives a response. So this is the stimulus organism response model. So this is a conceptual model. Within this, which is abstract, we are not showing here what stimulus is, what organism is, or what response is. But we can then, from this conceptual model, move towards a more detailed model, which would be like this. We say that training is a stimulus, organism, skill and motivation are the variables which are related to an organism because these are the internal characteristics or conditions of an organism, which in this case is an employee, and then productivity is a response given by the organism. So we can make a distinction between conceptual model and a research model, but most of the times these terms are used interchangeably. So to sum up the whole thing, a research model is a representation of theorized relationships between variables which we are studying. Those variables can have different name based on where they are within the research model. There can be independent variables which are influencing the dependent variable. Then the dependent variable is the one which is being influenced by the independent variable. Then there can be mediating variables that transfer the influence from independent to dependent variables, and then there can be moderating variables which control or influence the strength of relationship between other variables. And then we also saw that we can have another classification for these variables, that is endogenous and exogenous. Endogenous variables are those which are influenced by other variables within our model, and exogenous variables are those which are not influenced by other variables within our model. And then finally, we discussed that theoretical model or research model and conceptual models are the terms that can be used interchangeably, but some people insist that conceptual model is a bit different in the sense that it is more abstract. So thank you for watching.